Okay, here we are doing yet another lecture on European history. This is a history of modern Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. So this is continued. This will stress the 17th century, but some of the information we'll give, of course, comes out of the 16th. So we'll start with England in the 16th and 17th centuries. As I said in the last lecture, Mary was already ill when news of Calais came to her, and it broke her spirits completely. She also knew that her efforts to reestablish Catholicism had failed, as well as the fact that Elizabeth, daughter of her mother's supplanter, would reverse her religious policies. Childless, detested by her people, deserted by the one man she ever loved, Mary I died of dropsy on November the 17th, 1558. Which brings us to the reign of Elizabeth, who reigns from 1558 to 1603. While her half-sister was half Spanish, Elizabeth took pride in the fact that she was merely English. She was 25 years old at the time of her accession, described as moderately tall and well-proportioned in figure, and a face that was more pleasing than beautiful. Her attraction lay more in her personality than her looks. She was extremely vain, with an insatiable desire for flattery. Having been forced to dress plainly before she became queen, Elizabeth indulged her penchant for personal adornment and display. Despite her father's reservations, Elizabeth was she was eminently fitted to rule her nation. When Mary had become queen, she regarded Elizabeth as the center of all the plots against the throne. Once Elizabeth was even consigned to the Tower, being a prospect for the block. This phase in her life taught her patience, prudence, self-control, and self-reliance. Since she was always under such stress, she was forced to hide her thoughts and sentiments, emerging from this phase as a master in all of the arts of deceit. That said, Elizabeth always had a profound love for the people. She learned from Mary's mistakes, and so made every opportunity to strengthen her popularity with the people. There were three major problems facing Elizabeth as she took the throne. First was the settlement of the religious question. Second of all was the termination of the war with France. And thirdly was the restoration of finances and the national credit. To help her in accomplishing her goals to restore England's fortunes, Elizabeth chose as her principal minister William Cecil, Lord Burghley, who served her faithfully for 40 years. Burghley was a man of Protestant sympathies and combined a detailed knowledge of the workings of government with an amazing capacity for hard work. Impervious to bribes, calm, cautious, and methodical, Burghley had more influence than any other person during the first years of Elizabeth's rule. That said, Elizabeth was no mere figurehead, making decisions only as Burghley directed. Rather, her decisions were largely her own. Elizabeth, who thought religious arguments tiresome and boring, had been brought up in the Reformed faith like her brother Edward, but she also loved the pomp and circumstance of the Catholic mode of worship. Even after she cast her lot with the Protestants, she retained a crucifix and candles in her private chapel. Her ecclesiastical policy was largely dictated by politics. On the one hand, she naturally cherished the idea of opposition to papal supremacy. And as the daughter of Anne Boleyn, she could scarcely be expected to be drawn to a system that pronounced her illegitimate and thus unfit to occupy England's throne. On the other hand, she had little patience for the idea of ecclesiastical self-government sponsored by the Calvinists. Thus, Elizabeth steered a middle way between the Romanists and the Reformed. Her goal was a national church that was at once Protestant and Catholic, and as such would claim the allegiance of the majority of English people. While she believed that outward conformity was essential to national unity, she also permitted a certain freedom in private judgment. Thus, in 1559, Parliament repealed all of the reactionary laws passed during Mary's reign, and then passed a new Act of Supremacy, which declared the crown to be supreme in all causes ecclesiastical as well as civil, thereby putting the constitutional form of the church back to the condition where Henry VIII had left it. However, lest the title Supreme Head of the Church offend the consciences of some of her subjects, Elizabeth declined to accept it, piously declaring that it belonged to Christ alone. Thus she assumed the title of Supreme Governor. Parliament then passed the Act of Uniformity, by which the prayer book, slightly modified from the second prayer book of Edward VI, became the only legal form of worship. For the second time, it abolished Mass and established the Church of England as it still exists in our day, with the ruler of England as its head, with English as the language of worship, and with a clergy that was permitted to marry. Most citizens of England welcomed Elizabeth's compromises, especially after having lived through the days of Henry VIII and Bloody Mary. Of the 10,000 English clergymen that were in England at the time, only about 200 refused to accept the prayer book, and two groups, Calvinists and Catholics, saw Elizabeth's stance as only temporary. Calvinists looked forward to a time when the Anglican Church would be purged or purified of all Catholic excesses. In time, these Calvinists came to be called Puritans. Catholics looked forward to a time when Elizabeth would return to England to the fold of the Catholic Church. As it became clear that the Church of England would make no further concessions, open conflict between Catholics and Anglicans increased. In 1570, the Pope excommunicated Elizabeth and absolved all Catholics from allegiance to her. This papal bull of excommunication actually served to make England more Protestant than before, and that many who had wavered between the Roman Church and the English government now sided with the state. Henceforth, adherence to Rome not only meant dissent from the Anglican Church, but dissent from the state, and Parliament responded to the papal bull by making laws against Catholics more severe and enforcing them more rigorously. Perhaps the most disheartening experience of Elizabeth's long reign was the betrayal of her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. This episode unfortunately had religion as one of its chief underlying causes. Queen Mary Stuart's grandmother, Margaret, whose son was James V, Mary's father, and Queen Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, were brother and sister, making Mary and Elizabeth second cousins. Mary Stuart had been married to Francis II, King of France, and thus was Queen of France for 17 months. But Francis died in 1560, and so Mary Stuart returned to Scotland. Mary was considered quite attractive, with chestnut hair, dark brown eyes, and a charming personality. Her long sojourn in the French court, which placed her in an atmosphere of luxury, deceit, and corruption, made her self-indulgent, and she was as unscrupulous as Elizabeth. She was also equal with Elizabeth in coolness and courage, although she lacked the discernment of her elder cousin. Mary, having become thoroughly French, had little in common with her Scottish subjects and did not understand them. Scotland had established Calvinism by law, and so her Catholicism was obviously a source of friction between her and her subjects. To be sure, she was not the fanatical Catholic her late cousin, Bloody Mary, was, but her subjects, led by the fiery John Knox, suspected her to reestablish the religion of Rome. In 1565, Mary Stuart married her cousin, Lord Darnley, an English nobleman, and was also the next heir after Mary to the throne of England. Darnley, a handsome man of 20 when he married his queen, lacked both brains and morals, and his affections for low vices, which included gambling and women, soon lost the affection of his wife. As her love for her husband Darnley faded, Mary began to confide in her trusted secretary, David Riccio. Darnley, suspicious of foul play, had Riccio assassinated. Concealing her loathing for her husband, Mary then began to confide in the Earl of Bothwell, described as a man of reckless audacity, without scruple, and lacking in the ability to foresee the consequences of his actions. In February of 1567, while attending a wedding, Darnley's home was blown up with gunpowder, and Darnley himself was found dead in a nearby garden. Now, whether he was thrown out of the garden through the blast or was out gardening, I'm not really sure. This was done at night. Few people doubted that Bothwell had committed the murder, and placards proclaiming Bothwell the perpetrator were hung on the walls of Edinburgh to inform the government that the people knew the identity of the guilty man. While her participation in the murder has never been proven, suspicions of her guilt were confirmed in the minds of most people when almost immediately after Darnley was killed, Mary married Bothwell. The people were outraged, and the lords of Scotland arrested Mary and confined her to Lochleven Castle. There she was forced to sign a decree of abdication, recognizing her 13-month-old son, James VI, as King of Scotland. After being imprisoned for 10 months, Mary contrived to escape and rally a few supporters about her. But her small army was defeated. Desperate, she sought refuge in England, writing to Elizabeth that next to God I have no hope but in your goodness. Elizabeth was not pleased to have her ambitious rival in England, and so sought to restore her to the Scottish throne. But when she discovered that the Scottish lords were determined to not take her back, Mary ended up remaining a prisoner in England for 2 decades until her death. Prisoner in England is loose here. By prisoner in England, we mean she was mainly confined to the Tower. She didn't get out much. She had to stay sort of on the royal estate and on those grounds, but she did not live like a prisoner. She was not in jail. Outside of England and Scotland, there was much sympathy for Mary's cause, which made Elizabeth fear that a league may be formed against her. Fortunately for Elizabeth, both Spain and France were occupied with troubles at home. To be sure, plot upon plot was continuously formed to dethrone Elizabeth, many being funded by Spain and or France. Finally, Mary, whose imprisonment was becoming more and more rigorous, became extraordinarily rash in her intrigue, snatching any and every opportunity which promised liberation. And so in the spring of 1586, a plan known as the Babington Plot was devised to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary Stuart on the throne of England. Elizabeth's secretary, Walsingham, who seems to have known of the plot from its very inception, permitted it to develop until he had definite proof of Mary's complicity in the scheme. Mary was then brought to trial, found guilty, and beheaded on February the 8th, 1587. The order was reluctantly given by Elizabeth. With Mary dead, Philip II of Spain realized that the only way to recapture England for Rome was to stop English attacks on Spanish commerce. For the famous sea dogs, Walter Raleigh, Francis Drake, and John Hawkins, among others, were becoming famous for their capture of Spanish ships and their taking of Spanish gold and other goods being shipped from the Americas to Europe. Elizabeth publicly denounced these raids while secretly funding them. And so Philip said, I have to take England by force. So he prepared to invade England. No longer would he attack England in behalf of Mary Stuart's line of succession, since before her execution she had bequeathed to him her claims to the English throne. Hence, Philip was now determined to conquer England for himself. After extensive preparations, Philip's fleet, which the Spaniards named the Invincible Armada, sailed from the Tagus in May of 1588 with disastrous results for Spain. The danger of invasion had drawn all Englishmen together. Patriotism for England reached a high pitch, with Catholics and Protestants standing together to beat back the attack of the enemy. The crushing defeat of the Spanish Armada shattered once and for all the myth of Spanish invincibility. No longer in fear of invasion and conscious of her supremacy at sea, England began to dominate the ocean with ever greater fury, preying on Spanish ships, plundering Spanish possessions, and even burning Spanish towns. English trade increased rapidly, and English discoverers were sailing on every sea. After the settlement of religious issues, Elizabeth's most important contribution to England's rise to power was her economic policies. National credit had been lost thoroughly because of the wasteful spending of her father, Henry VIII, along with his minting of mixed coins. These problems were not rectified during the reigns of her brother and sister. During the early years of her reign, Elizabeth's government called in all of the debased coinage and gradually replaced it with a pure coin. This replacement policy did not bring about an immediate drop in prices, but it did restore the national credit in the continental market, thereby greatly benefiting English trade. On the whole, Elizabeth's reign was one of commercial expansion and prosperity. English merchants and adventurers went to all parts of the world to sell their goods and to bring back new products. John Hawkins, for example, helped supply the Spanish-American plantations with slaves. Richard Chancellor established trade relations with Russia, which led to the founding of the Muscovy Company. Other trading companies like the Levant Company in the Mediterranean, the Eastland Company in the Baltic, the Guinea Company in West Africa, or the Guinea Company in West Africa, were all founded during this time. During her later years, the most important trading company was founded, namely the East India Trading Company. English industry profited greatly from the arrival of immigrants who had been driven from the Low Countries and from France by religious troubles. Foreign artisans infused new life into the old industries and also founded new crafts. Even the manufacturing of cloth, England's staple industry, was benefited through this influx of immigrants. The new life breathed into these industries, along with the creation of new ones, like manufacture of lace, thread, glass, needles, and the weaving of silk, meant that England's exports shifted from raw materials to manufactured goods. Following the mercantilist principles of the time, Parliament passed the Statute of Apprentices in 1563, which solidified economic principles that had been developing since the 14th century. This statute decreed that no workman can leave his place of employment after being hired for 1 year, nor could an employer fire him before that time was up. Also, to secure good workmen, as well as protect qualified workmen from unskilled laborers, it fixed the period of apprenticeship at 7 years. Finally, it ordered judges to fix fair wages for laborers in their respective districts. The statute remained in force until the second decade of the 19th century. It was supplemented in 1601 by the Great Poor Law, providing the destitute with relief, giving employment to those who could work, and sending vagrants to the house of correction or common jail. It looks like goal, but in Old English, that's the word for Joel or jail. While enclosures slacked a bit at the end of her reign, Elizabeth's government was never able to really solve this problem, which remained a source of many complaints and much unrest. As far as ending the war with France is concerned, Elizabeth and her advisors knew that with the English army in disarray and the navy in a state of decay, England needed a period of tranquility to restore the economy and build the army and navy. France and Spain also wanted peace, and so the three nations met at Cadeau-Cambresis in 1559, the most important term being Elizabeth's conceding Calais to the French. This ended up being a blessing, since it relieved England of a great expense and made her withdrawal from foreign affairs easier. In the same year, Elizabeth sent forces to Scotland to assist the Protestants in freeing that country from French domination. The Treaty of Edinburgh, signed in 1560, ensured France's withdrawal from Scotland and assured the ascendancy of the Reformational Party. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth sought to keep Scotland in firm alliance, which guaranteed little to no foreign involvement. Mary Stuart's fiasco accepted, and protected England's borders against a Scottish invasion. Because a French and Spanish alliance always presented a possible threat to her reign and to England, Elizabeth engaged in a series of intrigues, giving orders in such a way that she could disavow them, couched her language so ambiguously that it was left open to interpretation, and planned her course in such a way that retreat was always an open option. A Spanish ambassador once said of her, "Your lordship will see what a pretty business it is to treat with this woman, who I think must have 100,000 devils in her body, notwithstanding that she is forever telling me that she yearns to be a nun and to pass her life in prayer." She even used her status as a single lady to her advantage. Even though every eligible prince in Europe wanted her hand, she only made herself available if it suited her plans for England, prolonging her courtships to such ends or terminating them quickly. No one knew for sure why she stayed single, and it continues to be debated today. She will forever remain the Virgin Queen. Just to, if you'll indulge me in my opinion, I think that she realized that it was a no-win situation. If she married a nobleman from her own country, the Tudor dynasty would end, and she may even lose her authority. And if she married a prince from another country, England would be yoked with that country. And so she decided to sort of sacrifice the Tudor dynasty and while at the same time preserve England by remaining the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth's last years were spent in relative isolation, oppressed by loneliness and old age. Her faithful ministers were dead, and those who remained were spending all of their time trying to win the favors of Elizabeth's successor. When her one remaining favorite advisor, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, started a revolution in London, Elizabeth did not save him from the block. Robbed of her spirit, she died on March the 23rd, 1603. Most were amazed that a woman could achieve what she achieved, and I think I've said this many times, she is my favorite British monarch. A popular ballad written at the time of her death said the following: "She ruled this nation by herself and was beholden to no man. Oh, she bore the sway of all affairs, and yet she was but a woman." The English Renaissance. Before we proceed to the Stuart dynasty, it may be helpful to look briefly at the English Renaissance. In England, the Renaissance was limited largely to humanism, for there was little English Renaissance painting or sculpture, and the revival of architecture did not take place until the 17th century. The beginning of a humanistic spirit is already visible in the later writings of Chaucer, who, like Boccaccio, was an exponent of the secular view of life. But the period after Chaucer was not favorable to the new learning. In the 15th century, the Wars of the Roses and the persecutions of the Lollards kept the country in a state of turmoil. During the second half of the century, a number of English scholars studied in Italy, but their influence on the course of English scholarship was hardly discernible. Not until Henry VII had restored peace and order, and the rapidly expanding commerce and industry had brought wealth and leisure for intellectual pursuits, did conditions favor the spread of the new culture. Then interest in classical learning was quickened by a group of notable men, often known as the Oxford Reformers. The outstanding members of the Oxford Reformers included men like William Grocyn, Thomas Linacre, John Colet, one of the first to advocate a critical reading of the New Testament, and of course Sir Thomas More. All but the last studied in Italy in the later years of the 15th century, and they brought back with them an enthusiasm for the classics. Their interests were primarily religious. They took up a study of Greek mainly for the purpose of understanding the New Testament. Like Erasmus, they were trying to restore Christianity to its primitive purity. The outstanding figure among the Oxford Reformers, of course, is Thomas More. He studied under Grocyn and Linacre. After studying in Oxford, More became a lawyer, reaching the highest rank in that profession, becoming Lord Chancellor. His true love was the classics, and so he made a reputation translating classical Greek epigrams into Latin elegant verse. But his greatest achievement was his Utopia, published in Latin. Utopia satirically describes More's ideal society, where he describes literally the land of nowhere, where there is no private property, labor is transformed into recreation, poverty is unknown, money is only used in transactions with other nations, war is outlawed except for self-defense, and all men are brothers. Indirectly, Utopia is a trenchant criticism of the various abuses occurring in his day and calls for readjustments: the abuses of power in high places, dynastic wars, the wretched poverty among the working classes, the evils resulting from enclosures, and so forth. Utopia could not be published in England. It was published in Louvain and edited by Erasmus. It never appeared in English during his lifetime. And the main influences were Plato's Republic and Amerigo Vespucci's descriptions of his travels. Besides More, there are the stage productions written by Shakespeare, who flourished during the reign of Elizabeth. Of course, your familiarity with this material comes from your English classes, and so renders a full discussion of it here unnecessary. The reign of James I, who reigns from 1603 to 1625. History is full of ironies, and the story of who succeeds Elizabeth is as ironic as they come. Having beheaded her close cousin, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, Elizabeth went to her grave knowing that her next of kin, James VI, King of Scotland and son of Mary Stuart, would be her successor. James was famously called the wisest fool in all of Christendom by Henry IV, King of France, or more specifically by the Duke of Sully, Henry's financial advisor. To be sure, his reign in Scotland was mostly successful, and many English delighted in the peaceful transition of power between the Tudor and Stuart dynasties. Also, the fact that he was Scottish appealed to many of the Protestants in England, especially the Puritans. The thought was that since Presbyterianism, that is Reformed Protestantism, flourished in Scotland under James's rule, he would bring the same kind of tolerance and religious reform to England. James was nothing that the English had hoped for. He spoke with a funny accent. He had a weird gait, spindle shanks, a slavering mouth, ungracious manners, and a blundering tongue. In short, little dignity becoming of royalty. He was also vain, resolute, and lazy. On the other hand, he was decently educated, loved theological dispute, generally good-natured, and even had a command of several foreign languages. What he lacked was practical wisdom to deal with the concerns of his day. Hence Sully's famous comment about him. As we saw before, James was crowned as James VI when he was only 13 months old. And since he obviously couldn't reign, he was placed under the care of his bastard half-brother, since his mother, being in jail and then later headless, could not care for him. The brother's name was James Stuart, and he was eventually assassinated in 1570. At the age of 15, James came under the tutelage of Esme Stuart, first cousin of Lord Darnley and future Earl of Lennox, and the physical affection between the two raised a number of eyebrows. In 1589, at the age of 23, James married Anne of Denmark by proxy. That means that they were not with each other when they actually got married. They eventually came together and produced 3 children, including Charles, Elizabeth, and Henry. And so, as we have seen, James ascended the throne of England in 1603, now being the king of both realms. England, Scotland, and Ireland were united by James as a personal union, that is, a union of 2 or more kingdoms under one monarch. Scotland and England retained their own parliaments, laws, judges, lawmakers, and so forth, and yet they were united by one ruler. This personal union in 1603 will pave the way for the active union of 1707. James believed in the absolute rule of the monarch. He said kings are the breathing images of God on earth. Thus the king is bound by no law. As in Elizabeth's day, so also in James's, there was religious dissent. In the early 1600s, a radical group of Catholics plotted to blow up Parliament with 36 barrels of gunpowder. This is the famous gunpowder plot of November the 5th, 1604, Guy Fawkes being a chief culprit in the plot, the purpose being to destroy Parliament, thereby leaving James as the sole ruler of the nation. In short, the purpose of the gunpowder plot was to destroy limited government and establish tyranny. And so it is not without a bit of irony that the famous movie V for Vendetta has the protagonist, a man who longs for the freedom of his nation, wear a Guy Fawkes mask. This is generally the way politics and religion broke down in both England and France. Those who were Protestant, and especially Calvinists, believed in limited government, while those who were Catholic and are held to a strong episcopacy believed in the absolute rule of monarchs. In 1604, just before the gunpowder plot, James himself moderated a debate between Puritans and High Church Anglicans. After hearing the arguments of the Puritans in the debate, James became fearful that their theology would inspire the end of kingly rule in England and the beginning of anarchy. And so before the end of the year, he censured Puritan theology and forced all clergymen to conform their worship, services, and preaching to the Anglican Book of Prayer. This event inspired many Puritans to become pilgrims who first journeyed to Holland and then later to America in 1620 to establish a colony in Plymouth. James's dealings with Parliament were also strained. For example, Elizabeth was a single woman, and while she was fond of beautiful and expensive clothes, along with elaborate parties, her daily expenses nevertheless remained quite modest because, again, she was single. James, on the other hand, was married, and since he too had a penchant for spending money, and the same can be said of his own wife, the family expenses of the Stuarts soon became a strain on the royal treasury. When Parliament refused the revenues he wanted to support his own family, among other things, James raised taxes without Parliament's permission. James also yoked his nation to Catholic Spain by betrothing Charles to a Spanish princess. This was an embarrassing episode in the life of Charles, who actually sailed a ship to Spain to woo his would-be bride. Unfortunately, she refused to even come out and meet him, and so he returned home in disgrace. Humiliated, Charles demanded that his father go to war with Spain. Fortunately, his marriage to the French princess Henrietta Maria, daughter of Henry IV and Marie de Medici, calmed him down. To be more accurate, there were unsuccessful naval raids against the Spanish coast, led by George Villiers, 1st Duke of Buckingham, early in Charles's reign, but the assassination of the Duke put an end to those. And in the absence of the Duke, Charles began to dote on his bride. James died in 1625 at the age of 56. So that brings us to the reign of Charles I, who reigns technically from 1625 to 1649, but we know that by the mid-1640s, he really has lost control of England. He becomes a prisoner in late 1646, early 1647, and he is executed a few years after that. To appease his Catholic wife, the penal laws against Catholics were relaxed and or repealed by Charles. This created tension within his realm. In fact, tensions between Charles and Parliament existed right at the beginning of his reign. His relaxing of the penal laws against Catholics incensed Parliament to the point where they no longer trusted the king to preserve Protestantism in England. To evince their distrust of the king, the House of Commons voted to give the king his annual salary only in yearly increments, despite the fact that since the reign of Henry IV of England, salaries were voted to be given to the king for life. Moreover, it refused, that is to say, the House of Commons, refused to vote for adequate supplies for the conduct of war against Spain because it had no assurance that Charles and Buckingham would use them for that purpose. And so Charles dismissed Parliament within 2 months, trying to raise funds for his war with Spain by borrowing the money. But after a humiliating naval defeat, Charles was forced to call Parliament to session once again in 1626. Parliament, now more conscious than ever of Charles's weaknesses, voted to impeach Buckingham. And so to save his favorite minister, the king dissolved the legislature once again after only 3 months. In 1628, after exhausting every means possible for raising funds, Charles called Parliament to session once again. The Commons, intent on addressing grievances against the king before voting over war supplies, drafted a document known as the Petition of Right into law. This petition ensured that, first of all, the king could never impose new taxes on the people without Parliament's consent. This is the 17th century version of no taxation without representation. Second of all, the king could not imprison anyone without bringing a specific charge against him. Thirdly, the king could not billet soldiers in private houses. That is, he could not force people to accept soldiers to take care of them in their private homes. And fourthly, the king could never declare martial law in times of peace. Charles, desperate for money, affixed his signature to the document. Next, the Commons demanded the impeachment of Buckingham, whereupon Charles prorogued the session. That is to say, he adjourned the meetings temporarily. Buckingham gets murdered by a man who had a private grievance against him. And so the Commons met yet again to list other complaints against the king. Their final meeting was exciting in that while soldiers stood in the hallway, banging on the doors to be let in so they could dissolve the parliament, the Speaker of the House was forced to sit in his chair as the body voted on a resolution that outlawed innovations in religion, an obvious obstruction to the reintroduction of Catholic practices within the Anglican Church. They also voted in favor of an order forbidding the collection of money by the king without the Parliament's authorization. To sum up, Charles's marriage to a Catholic, his unsuccessful raids against Spain, his ceding an English fleet to Louis XIII, with whom he had made a secret treaty, and his promoting Richard Montague, an Arminian cleric, to the royal chaplaincy, did little to endear him to Parliament. Hence the signing of the Petition of Right, and 1 year later, Charles's religious and economic disputes with Parliament came to a head when he disbanded the Congress and even had several members arrested. The 11 years of Charles's personal rule were seen as 11 years of tyranny by most people living in England, despite the fact that ruling in the absence of Parliament was not without precedent in English history. The fatal mistake that Charles made in his reign occurred in 1637, when Bishop William Laud, under Charles's order, tried to impose the Anglican Book of Common Prayer upon the Scots, a land full of Presbyterians. The Scots rioted everywhere the prayer book was used in church, and eventually banded together to sign a national covenant for the defense of the Presbyterian faith. To enforce obedience, Charles sent an English army into Scotland, an army not well trained, not well funded, not well disciplined, and not very enthusiastic about the king's order. They faced a Scottish army that was in all respects better equipped and better trained than them. The king was so certain of his army's defeat that he called for a truce before the fighting even began. However, he had no intention of keeping his end of the bargain, for he immediately summoned Thomas Wentworth, who was subduing the Irish, to now subdue the Scots. Wentworth knew that he could not do this without raising an army, and to do that, Charles needed money, and to get that, he needed to summon Parliament. And so in April of 1640, the Parliament elected its members, with those supporting the court of the king losing badly, and in the initial sessions of the Congress, efforts were made to address economic and religious matters, insisting that these must be taken care of before Parliament could vote in favor of taking up arms against the king. Frustrated, Charles disbanded Parliament after 3 weeks, hence the name the Short Parliament. Popular sentiment and the need for revenue caused Charles to reconvene Parliament yet again in November of 1640. And immediately the Congress took steps to impeach members of the King's Council, including Wentworth. Things like this dragged on for about a year and a half until finally, after Charles was arrested without due process, after Charles arrested, he was not arrested. After he arrested without due process certain members of Parliament, some had escaped, the Parliament declared war on the king. While the king's forces were initially victorious after several key engagements, things took a bad turn for the king when Parliament made an agreement with the Scots, to wit, that the Scottish army would fight in league with the English parliamentarians, eventually called Roundheads, against the king's army, eventually called Cavaliers. Second, upon victory, the parliamentarians agreed to establish Presbyterianism in England. Also, Oliver Cromwell appeared on the scene with his new model army, which proved decisive against the Cavaliers. This was all in 1643. 3 years later, the king surrendered to the Scots, who handed him over to Parliament, and they then returned to Scotland. That is, the Scottish army returned to Scotland. The war was essentially over by 1647, and in 1649, Charles was executed. So the Commonwealth lasts from 1649 to 1660. Oliver Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector of the land, but soon Cromwell's power went to his head and the people began to long for the return of the king. When Oliver died and was succeeded by his son Richard, whose inability to make decisions earned him the nickname Queen Dick, the call for the return of the Stuarts only increased. Richard died in 1659, and this paved the way for the restoration of the Stuart monarchy. The reign of Charles II takes us from 1660 to 1685. Charles spent the years after his father's death with his family, that is, mother and brother, which was protected by their cousin Louis XIV. He has been nicknamed the Merry Monarch, mainly because he got along well with Parliament, although he did enter into a secret agreement with Louis that in the event he openly declared his allegiance to Catholicism, he would receive a large sum of money from the Sun King. Charles died of apoplexy in 1685, which brings us to the reign of James II, who reigned from 1685 to 1688. This short reign of the brother of Charles II is explained by the rumors of a fake son being born to him. Since everyone knew James was Catholic, and since his second wife, an Italian princess named Mary of Modena, who was also Catholic, his first wife was a commoner named Anne Hyde. She died in 1671, having given birth to two daughters, Mary and Anne. And this Mary and Anne would be Mary II, of course, and Anne. Both became queens of England. And so fear gripped the hearts of parliamentary leaders, their fear being that the royal couple would have a son who would reign as king, resulting in Catholics ruling over England in perpetuity. Rumors of a fake son eventually became true. Rumors of a fake son eventually became true tales of a real one. And when we combine the birth of James's son with the imposition of the Declaration of Indulgence, a document that called for the indulgence or toleration of practicing Catholics throughout the realm, we can imagine what the Protestants in Parliament thought as their worst nightmare became true. The Whigs in Parliament, in light of all this, hatched a scheme to invite Mary, the daughter of James II via his first wife, and her husband, Prince William of Orange of Holland, to take the throne of England. William landed in England with a great army, and soon the allies of James abandoned him. William was crowned William III, while James fled to France, where he lived out his remaining years in the palace of Saint-Germain. This brings us to the reign of William III and Mary II. Upon James's flight, the dates are off here, that's 1688 to 1702. Upon James's flight, the House of Commons, with a Whig majority, quickly resolved that the throne was vacant and that it was safer if the ruler was Protestant. There were more Tories in the House of Lords, which would not initially agree, but after William refused to be a regent or to agree to remain king only in his wife's lifetime, there were negotiations between the two houses, and the Lords agreed by a narrow majority that the throne was vacant. The Commons made William accept a Bill of Rights, and in February of 1689, Parliament passed the Declaration of Right, in which it deemed that James, by attempting to flee, had abdicated the government of the realm, thereby leaving the throne vacant. William then summoned a convention of the Estates of Scotland, which met in March of 1689 and sent a conciliatory letter, while James sent haughty, uncompromising orders, swaying a majority in favor of William. On the 11th of April, the day of the English coronation, the convention finally declared that James was no longer King of Scotland. William and Mary were offered the Scottish crown, and they accepted on the 11th of May. William encouraged the passage of the Toleration Act of 1688, which guaranteed religious toleration to certain Protestant nonconformists. It did not, however, extend toleration as far as he wished, still restricting the religious liberty of Roman Catholics, non-Trinitarians, and those of non-Christian faiths. In December of 1689, one of the most important constitutional documents in English history, the Bill of Rights, was passed. The Act, which restated and confirmed many provisions of the earlier Declaration of Right, established restrictions on the royal prerogative. It provided, amongst other things, that the sovereign could not suspend laws passed by a parliament, levy taxes without parliamentary consent, infringe the right to petition, raise a standing army during peacetime without parliamentary consent, deny the right to bear arms to Protestant subjects, unduly, that's to say, I made a mistake here, denied the right to bear arms to non-Protestant subjects, unduly interfere with parliamentary elections, punish members of either house of parliament for anything said during debates, require excessive bail, or inflict cruel and unusual punishments. I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. I said I made a mistake. They wanted to give Protestant subjects the right to bear arms, and they denied the sovereign, that is to say, they denied the king, the right to deny the right, or to deny the Protestant subjects the right to bear arms. So it read correctly the first time. William was opposed to the imposition of such constraints, but he chose not to engage in a conflict with Parliament and agreed to abide by the statute. The Bill of Rights was also settled the question of succession to the crown. After the death of either William or Mary, the other would continue to reign. Next in the line of succession would be Mary II's sister, Princess Anne, and her issue, followed by any children William might have by a subsequent marriage. Roman Catholics, as well as those who married Catholics, were excluded. In terms of foreign policy, the main issue confronting William was his war with France, which is discussed while we discuss Louis XIV. Mary died in 1694 of smallpox. William died 8 years later, from pneumonia contracted after falling off of a horse and breaking his collarbone. Spain in the 16th through the 17th centuries. And that brings us to the reign of Philip II, who reigns from 1556 to 1598. Philip was born in Valladolid, being the son of Emperor Charles V and Isabella of Portugal. The great hero of his youth was his own father, whom he imitated in every way possible. However, while Charles could be jovial whenever the occasion demanded, like a party, Philip was almost always cold and reserved, kind-hearted and genial only in private company, and then only to those he genuinely liked. As a child, he was already obstinate and self-willed, presaging the man who was to be impervious to the influence of others, once his mind was made up. Below middle size in stature and quite thin, his features bore a strong resemblance to those of his father, though in Philip the Habsburg protrusion of the lower jaw was more marked than his dad's. He lacked the physical vigor that characterized his father even into middle age, and showed hardly any interest in activities such as jousting and hunting, hobbies of his father. His dad was a warrior who led his armies to battle. Philip was a king, more politician than statesman, who sent his armies into battle, thereby giving others the honor of leading his forces into harm's way. So deficient was he in a warlike spirit that many suspected him of cowardice, and yet the people probably loved him more than they did his father, perhaps because he was a true Spaniard, while Charles was the son of a German. At 16 years of age, Philip married his first cousin, the Portuguese princess Maria. The purpose of the marriage was to increase the chances of uniting the whole Iberian Peninsula under Spanish rule. They produced a son, Don Carlos. Don Carlos was born in 1545 and proved to be a tragic figure. He was weak, both mentally and physically, as a child, and showed clear signs of insanity as a young man. Carlos cherished such a hatred for his father that he even contemplated murdering Philip. In 1568, Carlos died under suspicious circumstances while making plans to flee from Spain. Some historians have actually accused Philip of murdering his own son, though there is no proof of this. Unfortunately, Maria died while giving birth to Carlos. After the death of Maria, Carlos began looking for another bride for his son. His final choice was Mary Tudor, and though she was described to Philip as skinny, pimply, and sickly, the prince gave no protest against his father's wishes. I very well see the advantage that might accrue from the successful conclusion of this marriage, he wrote to his father. The marriage was concluded in 1554, though as we have seen, Philip rarely saw his bride. In 1555, Charles invested his son with the rule of the Netherlands, and within a year Charles abdicated his throne, giving his son the Spanish crown and all the privileges that go with it. Philip was now ruler over the entire Western Hemisphere, except Brazil, and a few islands in the Caribbean, from Tierra del Fuego in Florida and New Mexico, and he controlled or ruled over the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily, along with the Duchy of Milan, Burgundy, and 5 ports and fortified places in Africa. During the first 2 years of his reign, Philip was occupied with his war with France, which had broken out afresh in 1557. Assisted by troops supplied by Mary Tudor, he invaded France and gave crushing defeats of them at St. Quentin and Gravelines. However, he did not take advantage of these victories and marched on to Paris. Instead, Philip sued for peace, for his treasury was empty and his soldiers were unpaid. Also, both Philip and Henry II of France wanted peace in order to proceed against the Protestant heresy that was spreading across their domains. But the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, concluded in 1559, already into Elizabeth's reign, Spain and France restored everything they had taken from each other since 1551, while England lost Calais to France. Philip also agreed to marry Elizabeth of Valois, the 14-year-old daughter of Henry II, hoping through this marriage to isolate Elizabeth I of England, who had refused Philip's offer of marriage. Yes, Philip actually asked Elizabeth to marry him. Philip then turned his attention to the Netherlands, organizing the administration there. Afterwards, he returned to Spain in 1559, never to leave Iberia again. Philip believed his right to rule came to him from God, and so he was accountable to God alone for his actions. Accordingly, he regarded his power as absolute. As early as the age of 16, during his father's absence from Spain, he had served as co-regent with Cardinal Tavera, showing how, from an early age, his father trained him in the art of governance and jurisprudence. Charles even drew up minute instructions as guides for Philip. Two principles were stressed in these guides. First, listen to everyone's opinions, but trust no one. And two, avoid hasty decisions because they were usually bad. Taking his father's advice into what can only be considered an extreme, Philip relied on no subordinates, distrusting all of them, and so he aspired to do everything himself. He was his own chief minister, and every issue, no matter how trivial, had to be brought to his attention. And so, with colossal industry, he read every report and letter that fell upon his desk, spending hours and hours on minutiae, while matters of grave importance were often neglected. So as to avoid hasty decisions at all costs, Philip never saw one issue as more important than another. He saw his authority as God-given, and so his labor was of God as well. And so it would be blasphemous to prioritize one task over the other. The result of all this was a government that was virtually paralyzed over Philip's indecisive disposition. To give one example, under critical circumstances, Philip left his ambassador's dispatches unanswered for 8 months. Philip's policies were the same as his father's. The European powers envied Spain's dominance, and so did everything they could to lessen it. As a consequence, Philip was almost constantly at war. To be sure, Charles had advised his son to avoid armed conflict whenever possible, but Philip's policies and disposition ensured that he would be in perpetual conflict with other powers. This is seen in the four major problems he faced in foreign policy. And I believe it's three problems, but who's counting? First, the Turks. In 1570, the Turks, under the rule of Selim II, conquered the island of Cyprus, being now in a position to threaten all of Europe. That same year, a league was formed between Venice, Spain, Rome, and Austria to counter the Turkish menace, with Don John of Austria, Philip's half-brother, being commander-in-chief of all the forces. On October the 7th, 1571, the European fleet under Don John, consisting of 264 vessels and 79,000 men, met the Turkish fleet consisting of about 300 vessels and more than 100,000 men at Lepanto in the Gulf of Corinth. After 4 hours of fighting, the forces under Don John won a decisive victory, being the first time the Turks had lost an engagement at sea. The results of the Battle of Lepanto were as follows. The Turks made no further advances into Europe, not merely because of the battle, to be sure, but because of the internal decay in the Ottoman Empire. And while Don John wished to sail all the way to Constantinople or Istanbul and destroy the Ottoman Empire, that was not to be. Second, and perhaps most vexing, is the Netherlands. In 1566, the Dutch rebelled against Philip's rule, and during the remainder of his reign, the question of how to quell the uprising overshadowed all of his other difficulties. Besides severely draining the royal treasury, the Dutch rebellion also affected Philip's relationship with other rulers, particularly Elizabeth I of England. In the end, his efforts were only met with partial success. He managed to win back the allegiance of the Belgian Netherlands, but failed to fully subdue the Dutch. Assisted by the natural defenses of their country and by outside aid, most notably that of England, the small Dutch nation fought savagely against Spain's strongest armies and ablest commanders until complete independence was achieved by the middle of the 17th century. The basic sequence of events for the Dutch War for Independence is as follows. In April of 1566, 400 nobles from the various provinces in the Netherlands congregated in Brussels to present to the Regent Margaret of Parma a petition which they had drawn up. The petition requested that the Inquisition and the edicts against heresy be moderated and that the States General be convened at regular times, and it added that there was great danger of revolt if this were not done. According to the report, When Margaret of Parma promised to give serious consideration to the petition, one of her counselors exclaimed, "It is possible that your highness can fear these beggars?" When this derisive remark reached the petitioners, they adopted the name gueux, beggars, which gradually became the designation of all those opposed to Philip's government. Soon the cry, "Vive les gueux," was heard not only in noble circles, but also among the burghers generally. While the petitioners were awaiting the answer of Philip, who as usual was taking a sweet time coming up with a response, religious riots broke out. In Antwerp, mobs, who were roused to a high pitch of excitement by Calvinistic preachers, entered the Catholic churches of the city, smashed the images and statues which adorned the buildings, broke the stained glass windows, defaced the paintings on the walls, and wrecked many altars. The wave of iconoclasm spread to other cities, and for a time, many districts were in a state of turmoil. More sober leaders of the opposition, like the Prince of Orange, exerted themselves to the utmost to repress the furious iconoclastic outbursts, and with their help, Margaret of Parma was finally able to restore order. Besides inflicting incalculable injury on treasures of medieval art, the outbreaks compromised the cause of the patriots by prompting many Catholic nobles to withdraw their support from it. Philip responded to the riots by sending a force under the leadership of the Duke of Alva to the Netherlands. Most of the Dutch went into a panic upon hearing of the arrival of the army. Others hoped and prayed that Alva would be lenient. But these hopes were dashed to stones when Alva organized a special tribunal, officially known as the Council of Troubles, but properly called the Council of Blood, to root out heresy and try those who had participated in the riots or been in any way responsible for them. Margaret resigned. Alva ordered those accused of heresy to be given farcical trials before being condemned to death. Even the Pope, along with numerous Catholics, protested Alva's brutal methods of interrogation, torture, and execution. While he boasted that he had killed over 18,000 heretics in the Netherlands, most historians believe he purposefully exaggerated those numbers. Both peasants and nobles suffered the same fate. William, Prince of Orange, would have been executed as well had he not fled to Germany. But when he did not heed the call of the authorities to return to his homeland, his property was confiscated and the prince was declared an outlaw. The climax of Alva's tyranny was reached in 1569 when, to pay the expenses of his own system, he imposed a tax of 1% on all real or personal property, 5% on the sale of landed property, and 10% on the sale of all movable goods. The last tax proved so harmful to commerce and caused such widespread suffering among the working classes that the Protestants poured in upon Philip from all sides. Alva was eventually forced to abolish the tax altogether. After 6 years of Alva's rule, he was relieved of his post, having failed to please Philip, placate the Dutch, or suppress the heresy spreading through the Low Countries by William of Orange, who was also known as William the Silent. Since his exile, spent a great deal of time raising an army and increasing his own skills in battle, he launched his first attacks on Spanish strongholds in the Netherlands in 1569. His first successes were accomplished on the sea. Throughout the 1570s, tensions arose between Catholics and Calvinists, all of whom were trying to fight for independence from Spain. The tensions came to a head when in 1579, Farnese, leader of the Catholic faction, formed the League of Arras for the defense of the Catholic religion, which was centered in the southern provinces of the Netherlands. William of Orange, of course, led the Calvinists in the northern provinces to form the Union of Utrecht, which united 7 provinces in defense of their rights against the rule of Philip. While the Union was regarded as merely temporary, the Articles of Union eventually became the Constitution of the United Provinces. Henceforth, the southern and northern provinces went their separate ways, the former professing their allegiance to Spain, with the latter continuing their struggle to be free of it. From the Union of Utrecht to the proclamation of independence was only a short step. This was taken when in 1581 the representatives of 7 provinces completely renounced their allegiance to the King of Spain. The act of abjuration, often called the Dutch Declaration of the Rights of Man, was a pioneer utterance and set the model for declarations issued during the Puritan Revolution of the 1540s, the French Revolution of the 1790s, and the American War for Independence of the 1770s. The opening sentence reads, "The people were not created by God for the sake of the prince, but, on the contrary, the prince was made for the good of the people." The relationship between ruler and subject, the Declaration contends, is defined by the law of the country, and since Philip has not observed this law, the Dutch are justified in deposing him. In 1584, William of Orange died by the hands of an assassin. William, who is one of the most celebrated and vilified persons in history, actually lacked military acumen, but nevertheless one of the great diplomatists in human history. William's oldest son was in prison, and so his second son, Prince Maurice, took command of the Dutch forces, driving the Spanish out of the northern provinces by the middle of the 1580s. In 1588, the provinces became a confederacy, gaining de facto independence by this time. Of course, Philip, being stubborn and indecisive, refused to recognize Dutch independence and even went on to his grave in 1598 in his recalcitrance. To be sure, little to no fighting was done within the provinces themselves, while Maurice secured the borders of the Dutch provinces throughout the 1590s. In 1609, a truce was written between the two nations that lasted for about 12 years, at which time hostilities broke out again in both Spain and Holland, where they were drawn into the 30 Years' War. The Treaty of Westphalia finally guaranteed a peace between Spain and the Netherlands, and so the Dutch Republic was finally recognized as independent in 1648. The Dutch War for Independence was fought off and on between 1668 and 1648, with the heaviest fighting have occurred in the 1570s and 80s. Hence, this war is often called the 80 Years' War. The excursus that will go on is a brief history of the Netherlands, 1600 to 1700. The so-called Dutch Republic was not a compact, homogeneous state, but a loose confederation of provinces, each of which remained a sovereign state with its own form of government. The confederation, in which Holland outweighed all the other states both in wealth and in importance, was based on the Union of Utrecht, which was drawn up under conditions of war and was ill-suited for a permanent government. So complicated was the organization of the government that it was difficult to tell just where the sovereignty ended and where it began. The States General, which met at The Hague and was composed of representatives of the 7 provinces, had supreme control of military and naval affairs. Actually, however, the members of the States General could do nothing on their own authority. They received their instructions from the provinces they represented and could not act accordingly. A majority in the States General could make a decision, but the decision was not binding for those who did not vote in favor of it. Besides States General, there was also a Council of State, consisting of the stadtholders or governors of the provinces and a total of 12 deputies from 7 provinces. This council exercised some power in military affairs and supervised the collecting of funds from the provinces for the common defense. Within the separate provinces, the government was conducted by the stadtholders and by the provincial estates composed of representatives of the nobility and the bourgeoisie. With such a medley of overlapping and conflicting authorities, unity of action would have been impossible without the steadying influence of the princes of the House of Orange, who gradually assumes the direction of foreign affairs and the general supervision of the administration of the Republic. During the War of Liberation, William the Silent and his successors had won so much prestige as leaders of the Dutch against Spain that they exercised an authority exceeding that of the offices they held. William the Silent had been stadtholder of only Holland and Zeeland. Maurice eventually became stadtholder of 5 provinces, and his successors, Frederick Henry, William II, and William III. William III was born 1 week after his father died of smallpox, and the Netherlands went into what is known as the First Stadtholderless period. It was during this struggle with Spain that the Netherlands became the greatest industrial nation of Europe and arguably the world. This preeminence was partly due to the great number of immigrants moving into the north from the southern or from the Spanish-held provinces from the south. Philip II extended his rule over Portugal during their secession crisis in 1580. Excuse me, it was a succession crisis in 1580, which I'll elaborate when I get back to the reign of Philip. In 1581, Philip closed Lisbon off from the Dutch. In response, the Dutch began journeying to India themselves, reaching the Asian continent in 1594. And in 1598, Admiral Van Neck was sent out by the merchants of Amsterdam with a fleet of 8 ships. When he arrived in the east, he made treaties with the native rulers of Java and other islands, expelled the Portuguese from some of their settlements, established Dutch factories, and finally returned to Holland with a valuable cargo of spices and silks. The success of Neck's adventure inspired other Dutch merchants to dispatch fleets so that no less than 65 ships were sent out before 1601. However, while the Dutch possessed the strongest economy for the first half of the 17th century, their decline began in 1652 when they entered their first in a series of commercial wars with England. Thirdly, Philip had to contend with England. He failed to subdue the English and bring them back to the Roman Church in 3 ways. First, he married Mary Tudor, whose death in 1558 ended his ultimate designs. Second, he proposed to her sister Elizabeth, who declined the offer. And third, he encouraged Mary, Queen of Scots, to start a coup against her cousin Elizabeth. But this was discovered, and so she was executed. Fourth, he invaded England only to witness his beloved Armada dashed against the shores of England. Although regarded by his contemporaries as the most powerful monarch in Christendom, Philip was on the whole a glorious failure. He was always on the verge of great accomplishments, but was able to carry few plans to a successful conclusion. Staking on the prominence of Spain in Europe and upon the victory of Catholicism, he labored strenuously and conscientiously, only to fail in the end. Yet Philip was immovable in the conviction that his policy was right because, as he believed, he was on the side of God. His far-reaching plans were not national, but religious and dynastic. They aimed solely at extending the influence of the Catholic religion and the power of his house. To his Spanish contemporaries, he was Philip the Prudent, an estimate in which neither the non-Spaniards of his time nor later generations have concurred. Proof of this is that the history of Spain in the 17th century saw little more than decline, with no genuine successes and or renovations of the political order. So that brings us to the reign of Philip III. His dates are 1598 to 1621. The son of Philip II, the competence of this man is easily ascertained upon hearing the words of his father, and just before his death in 1598, God, who has given me so many kingdoms, has denied me a son capable of ruling them. Indifferent to the widespread distress among the people, Philip III and his unscrupulous minister, the Duke of Lerma, continued to squander the revenues which the tax collectors squeezed out of the impoverished country. The reign of Philip IV. Even weaker, more immoral, and thus less scrupulous than his father, Philip IV led his nation into yet more financially distressful situations. Neither he nor his father before him hesitated to inflate the currency, with the result that the other nations drained the gold and silver from Spain until the coinage of the country consisted largely of copper, the value of which the government sought to sustain by law. To prevent the outflow of specie, Philip IV decreed the penalty of death and confiscation of property for all who were guilty of exporting it or of raiding others to do so. But even this decree proved ineffectual. Meanwhile, the government under Philip II's successors continued his foreign policy, getting Spain more steeped into wars that drained the economy and the blood of many Spaniards. In 1640, Portugal finally threw off the yoke of Spain. In 1580, there was no successor to the Portuguese monarch of the House of Aviz. And so Philip II of Spain assumed his authority over Portugal, being declared Philip I, King of Portugal. This drew Portugal under the auspices of Spain, which further drew it into the 80 Years' War between Spain and Holland, which in turn resulted in Portugal losing its dominance in Eastern trade. The Portuguese War for Independence was led by John IV, thereby establishing the House of Braganza, which ruled over Portugal until 1910. And this brings us to Charles II, who rules from 1665 to 1700. Known as Charles the Bewitched, this man was sickly in both mind and body and wholly incapable of running the government. How steady the progressive degeneration of the Habsburg rulers had been is indicated by the statement that Charles V, or Charles I of Spain, was a warrior and a king. Philip II was only a king. Philip III and Philip IV, not even kings, and Charles II, not even a man. His reign has also been characterized as one of royal anarchy, as it appeared that Charles II would be the last of his line, and that he might die at any moment. He was constantly surrounded by intrigues for the purpose of securing the succession. He continued to baffle Christendom by living much longer than expected. His death in 1700 was the signal for the outbreak of a general European war called the War of Spanish Succession. By this time, Spain had become a second-rate power. And now we're at France in the 17th century. That takes us from 1643 to 1700. The reign of Louis XIV. As fate would have it, Louis XIII died just 5 months after Richelieu. Thus, his 5-year-old son succeeded him as King of France. Because of his youth, he was unfit to reign, and so, in line with his father's wishes, his mother, Anne of Austria, served as regent. But she was a rather dull and lazy woman, and so she left the affairs of state to Jules Mazarin. Mazarin, an Italian by birth, was the protege of Richelieu, having become a cardinal through Richelieu's influence in 1641. However, he lacked the resolve and charisma of Richelieu, and thus did not rule with the same iron fist as his predecessor. He had to resort to craft and intrigue in order to overcome obstacles. Unfortunately, Mazarin soon faced a movement known as the Fronde, which rebelled against his policies a few years after he came to power. The word Fronde, or Fronde, refers to a sling boys used in the streets of Paris. It seems to have first been applied in mockery to the movement against the government, but soon became a permanent designation. Those who participated in the movement became known as frondeurs, a name which refers to street urchins who sling mud at passersby. There are 3 distinct elements which make up this revolutionary movement, namely the Parliament of Paris, which had long desired to share in the government. Second of all, higher nobles who had not yet reconciled themselves to being social ornaments. And thirdly, dissatisfied taxpayers who staggered under an oppressive tax burden. A lady of the court said it best when she exclaimed, "It was the fashion to hate Mazarin. He was a foreigner, serving an unpopular and foreign queen, carrying out the oppressive politics of a tyrant whose death was met with celebration." The revolt may be divided into the first and second Fronde. The first Fronde centered about the Parliament of Paris, the highest judicial tribunal of France, which had charge of the official registrar of the laws. Having long claimed the privilege of imposing a practical veto on the decrees of the king by refusing to enter them into the official registrar, the Parliament of Paris was encouraged by the success of the English Parliament to seek recognition of its claims. The Parliament of Paris was not, however, like the English Parliament, a representative assembly. It was a closed corporation of magistrates who had bought or inherited their judicial positions. Its motives in opposing the absolutism of the king were not so much concerned with the public welfare as the desire to secure privileges for itself. In 1648, a charter was presented to the regent in which the Parliament demanded that no new taxes be levied or new offices be created without his permission, that the extortions of the tax farmers be investigated, that the intendants be abolished, and that no one be kept in prison for more than 24 hours without being tried. When Mazarin ordered the arrest of the leaders of the Parliament, the people of Paris raised barricades in the streets. Later, civil war broke out. At first, the Parisian mob gained a few successes, but gradually the royal forces under the command of Condé put down the resistance, and the treaty ended the war on the 1st of April, 1649. Peace, however, was short-lived. The object of the movement was the removal of Mazarin, and since he remained in power after the First Fronde was over, it was only a matter of time before a second revolution would be attempted. Right after the first movement was suppressed, a new Fronde was organized among the higher nobility. Its outstanding leader was Condé, who had gone over to the opposition because he was dissatisfied with his position at court. Second, the Fronde did not, like the first aim, for constitutional reform. Neither did the nobles desire to dismember the kingdom. What the dukes, counts, marquises, and princes of the blood want is to overthrow Mazarin and to secure for themselves provincial governments, pensions, and gifts of money. The beginning of the revolt may be dated from the arrest of Condé and two other leaders of the movement by order of Mazarin in January of 1650. Soon, the Parliament of Paris and faction of the people of Paris joined the nobility against Mazarin, thus uniting all the dissatisfied parties. For a time, the Frondeurs under Condé were supreme in Paris, but gradually, when the people realized that the nobles were bent only on the advancement of their own interests, a reaction set in. Encouraged by the change in perspective, Mazarin, with the assistance of General Turenne, who had deserted the cause of the Frondeurs, gradually overcame the forces of the nobility, and the Second Fronde was over. The triumph of the royal cause was decisive. The system of attendance was restored. The Parliament of Paris was forbidden henceforth to take any part in state affairs, and Paris was deprived of the right to elect its municipal officials. It was the last attempt until the Revolution to limit the absolutism of the crown. Mazarin died in March of 1661. He had succeeded in suppressing the rebellion against the authority of the monarchy and in raising the prestige of France in Europe. But condition of the masses in France was pitiable indeed. Mazarin had been so busy suppressing revolts and completing the program of Richelieu that he had found no time to give thought to the problem of financial reform or to the welfare of the people. If the financial administration had been bad under the rule of Richelieu, it was even worse under Mazarin. In this respect, the rule of Mazarin was but another step in the decline and its inevitable consequence, the Revolution. By the time Mazarin had died, Louis XIV had come of age. While some monarchs such as Charles V and Philip II ruled larger domains than the Sun King, it is difficult to imagine any other monarch in the history of Europe at least, attaining the prestige and power Louis XIV did during his reign. He was the Grand Monarch, the Sun King, and the First Gentleman of Europe. About him gathered a group of notable figures such as Corneille, Condé, Racine, Moliere, La Fontaine, Colbert. He was the most famous prince of his time, which has ever since been known as the age of Louis XIV. His court set a standard of magnificence which contemporary and later rulers endeavored to imitate, but not to hope to equal. I'm going to repeat that sentence. His court set a standard of magnificence which contemporary and later rulers endeavored to imitate, but did not hope to equal. For the nobles of most European countries, the language, taste, spirit, and art of Versailles became obligatory. Society everywhere was French, remaining so until the 19th century. Most other countries, with England being the most notable exception, built palaces in the style of those of Louis XIV. The reign of Louis XIV was the culmination of the system of absolute monarchy which had been developing since the 100 Years' War. Before his advent, the royal absolutism had been opposed by factions within the state, and after his death, the monarchy showed symptoms of decay. But during his reign, there was little opposition to the royal will. Whether or not he uttered it, the saying "L'état c'est moi" represented the actual situation under Louis. All potential threats to the royal power were held in check, and the States General was never convened. Many of the provincial estates were suppressed, and those that survived were convened only to carry out the decrees of the king. Even the right of many cities to elect their mayors was abolished, being made an hereditary office sold by the king to the highest bidder. I am going to stop the verbal lecture here. There is other stuff in the notes. I'm flipping through the pageant of Versailles, the religion, his revocation of the Edict of Nantes being an important act on his part, and then of course the wars of Louis are all very important events in his reign. So I encourage you to study those notes as well. What I will also say is that the sections in the chapter 7 on Prussia and Russia, I'm going to hold off on asking anything about those countries until next term. So your tests will not have any questions about Russia or Prussia. And so that ends our study.